Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I want to take a look at literature before World War I and see how we see similar themes that we've been examining manifest within the literature. And we're going to focus on the poems of Thomas Hardy for this. And when you think about how do we see the similarities between these ideas that Thomas Hardy expresses and that what we've talked about within Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. A question just to kind of think about in general, right? How can we help someone who's experiencing a crisis of faith? And that's one of the themes that we've noticed within the modern world, within their art and literature, is that people are experiencing this crisis of faith. How do we move on? How do we connect with the divine in a world that seems as though it's lost and lost its direction? How do we maintain faith in a world that seems as though that it's losing, God is losing relevance? And so I just wanted to kind of think about that, and then I want to connect this to today. I wanted to show you a clip that gets us to think about these ideas, how relevant these ideas are, even though people are writing about them over 100 years ago.
You might have noticed that here in America, there's one group that's not nearly as involved or engaged in the church as other age groups, 18 to 29-year-olds. We call this generation the Mosaics, and for most churches, this is a demographic black hole.
Just to say, the church didn't put this out. This was another group of churches that put this out there. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Just how big of a black hole? Get this. 59% of Mosaics with a Christian background drop out of church after attending regularly as a teenager. Now, on the surface, this doesn't seem like a new problem. And in some respects, it isn't. People in this age group have left the church in droves for decades. But historically, many come back. If you think that's going to happen with today's generation, think again. Today's young adults are very different from their counterparts of the past. A lot of them are rethinking the major things in life. Stuff like whether or not marriage is still necessary, or if the church really matters. What's strange is, the majority of these dropouts actually still consider themselves Christians. They're big fans of Jesus, just not the church. Every Mosaic has their own unique reason for leaving the church. But ultimately, they all point their fingers at the Christian community. And what they're saying is, you lost me. Now, hold on. You lost me? Isn't that a little harsh? Well, maybe. But what a person really means when they say that to someone is, you're not making sense to me. Research from our team at Barna shows that millions of Mosaics don't feel like they can ask their most pressing life questions in church. So it's no wonder they turn to technology, pop culture, and their peers for answers. With all of the resources on the internet, young people have access to answers to lots of things, important and trivial. And some of the answers seem to make sense. But just because something makes sense, it doesn't mean it's the truth. Naturally, all that conflicting information leads to more questions and more confusion. These wandering souls are viewing the world through a distorted lens. They need the wisdom of the church to help them see things through the lens of faith. But they can't even see that. What we need is real dialogue, and real answers to the questions that all too often just get swept under the rug. It means we stop ignoring the elephant in the room, roll up our sleeves, and seriously address the tough questions about science, sexuality, culture, and lifestyle. Let's be careful not to judge them too quickly, and give our young Christians the tools they need to cope with the modern world. We need to teach them to be discerning in today's culture, to be influential among their peers as followers of Christ. Today's changing world is a tough place to live faithfully as a Christian at any age. But if we're going to change the world together, we can't afford to let another young person say, "You lost me."
So as we think about this growing phenomenon, I think it's important that number one, as we have people perhaps in our lives or will at some point experience people in our lives that are having a crisis of faith, that we approach them rather than with a dismissive attitude, but with an attitude of understanding what their concerns are, right? This is just a diagram that shows that I'm not sure what study did this. I think it was a Pew Research study. That talks about how young people are becoming less religiously affiliated. And so the millenniums, which are on the top right, almost not quite 30% of them say that they're not really religiously affiliated. And not to say that they're not spiritual, but they just have this apprehension or distrust excuse me, towards organized religion. And something that we need to think about is how do we approach people like this? Excuse me. And I think Thomas Hardy captures some of these ideas. I wanted to take a look at that as he's experiencing the turn of the century and these changes that Nietzsche examines about people losing their faith or losing their spirituality. He captures this within his poetry. And what I want you to think about as we go through this is what is he saying about religion? What's he saying about politics or nature and love? And how do we see this new image of humanity and this new image of God that he's reflecting, right? Kind of holding a mirror up to society and saying, this is who we are in the modern world. Taking a look at hap. And hap here doesn't refer to happiness. It refers to happenstance or chance, right? And so this is a poem to chance. He says, if but some vengeful God would call to me from up the sky and laugh, thou suffering thing, know that thy sorrow is my ecstasy and that thy love's loss is my hate's profiting, right? So that he invents this mythical kind of angry God. And he says that if there was a God that would shout at me and say, hey, your sorrow, your pain makes me happy, he says in the second stanza, then would I bear it, clinch myself, and die, right? Steeled or strengthened by the sense of ire or anger, unmerited. And so what he says is if there was an angry God, then I would just say, hey, I would be okay with that, right? I'd strengthen myself. And I want you to think about why that is. Why would an angry God make him feel better than no God at all? And I think part of the answer is then life would make sense. Right? And I want you to think about Nietzsche's ideas about where are we going, right? Those questions. If you remove spirituality, what's directing human events? He says, have ease that a powerfuler, and notice the capitalization of powerful, that's a person or an entity, right? So it's a name that he's given. So this God or this deity, that half ease that a powerful and I had willed and meted me the tears I shed, right? So that my pain would have purpose to it. But not so, he says in the last stanza. How arrives it? Joy lies slain. And so the question here is, what's the pronoun mean? The it, and that is happenstance. So whenever happenstance comes, it kills away our joy, right? So we're going along, and all of a sudden things happen that don't have any exterior meaning. So if you're removing providence from the equation, the question is, well, why do things happen? The answer then is that things happen because of chance, randomness. Why does it happen? It doesn't really have any greater meaning. It doesn't have any greater significance. And that provides some people greater pain, right? They want things to make sense. I don't know if you know people like that, but everything has to have a certain meaning. Everything has to have a certain purpose for them. Otherwise, it seems as though life is completely absurd. And we see that element within Hap. Sorry, I just dropped something. All right, continuing on, he says, and why unblooms the best hope ever sown, right? The unblooms are the things that haven't happened yet, right? And we kind of have this hope in tomorrow. Crass causality, or again that idea of chance, obstructs the sun and rain. And dicing time, again this idea of chance, right? Dicing is just you throw the dice and that's what time gives you. For gladness casts a moan, and these purblind doomsters had already strown my blisses about my pilgrimage as pain. And so he's the big humanities questions, who am I, why am I here, where am I going? Well, if you remove God from the equation, what's the meaning of life? Well, life has no meaning. And so that makes life seem even more painful because it doesn't necessarily make sense, and we want it to. I look into my glass, and Thomas Hardy is a British writer, and so the glass in England is a mirror. So he's not looking into his glass or his drink or something like that. He's looking into his mirror. So I want you to think about this is a representation of humanity as he looks at himself. What does he see, right? I look in my glass and I view my wasting skin and say, would God it come to pass, my heart had shrunk as thin. And so he sees himself wasting away. He sees his heart shrinking, his emotional capacity shrinking in this modern world. For then I, undistressed by hearts grown cold to me, could lonely wait my endless rest with equanimity. And so all he's kind of doing is looking at himself deteriorate each passing day, and he's just kind of waiting for it to end. Kind of a depressing thought. And I think it's kind of hard for people who are 18 to 25 to understand when you experience a midlife crisis. What's that really like? Because when you're 18 to 25, you kind of think that you're going to live forever, but But he suggests, what does life really mean, right? As you start to approach middle age and beyond, you start to question what legacy. How are people going to remember me? And how do I continue to struggle on in the midst of all of these struggles, right? What's it all mean? He says, but time to make me grieve, part steals and lets part abide. So each passing time, right, each passing moment, lets him live, right? But lets part of life abide, and then steals part. And so each passing moment lets us live, but also takes something from us, and shakes this frail frame at eve with throbbings of noontide. It's very similar to what we see with Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, right? That life can be painful, and how do you deal with the pain? And I think it's interesting that he says that he's going to meet this with equanimity, this inner strength, this inner fortitude. Even though he's facing these oppositions, he's going to continue to march on. And we see some similar ideas of kind of how the modern world is not this utopian society that we once thought it was, this Victorian hope in tomorrow, that it's actually causing people to be deteriorated, it's exploiting people, it's causing people to be downtrodden. And so then the question is, what do we do, right? And so Manet is causing us to kind of reflect and putting a mirror up to what society is causing. In a similar way, Hardy is holding a mirror up and saying, what are we causing? What are we doing? What's the whole point of all of this? And if it has no point, then are we not just deteriorating away? Impercipient is someone that fails to understand something. And in parentheses, we have, this is at a cathedral service. And so this person, it's as though he's looking in at a cathedral service and doesn't really understand what's going on the inside. And so again, this is this kind of a spiritual crisis of faith within the modern world. Here's just kind of going through the lines. He says that with this bright believing band, I have no claim to be. That faith by which my comrades stand seem fantasy to me. And mirage mist, their shining land is a strange destiny. So while they're all kind of inside happy and shouting and singing, their mirage mist, their shining land, this heaven, seems kind of a strange destiny. If you're thinking about, if you're making sense of the exterior world, idea of heaven seems a little bit weird when you're living in a lost, fallen state, right? So it just seems so far away, seems so foreign to anything that we experience. And so he's trying to understand, how do I make sense of this when all of my experiences have been one way and not this? He says, why thus my soul should be consigned to infelicity? So why am I condemned to be ununderstanding? I want to belong, right? That's what he's saying. He says, why always I must feel as blind as sights my brethren see? Why joys they find I cannot find abides a mystery. And so it's not as though he wants to remain in a spiritual crisis. He's desperately seeking to reconnect. Since heart of mine knows not that ease which they know, since it be that he who breathes all's well to these, breathes knows all's well to me, my lack might move their sympathies and Christian charity. And so he's thinking, am I missing something? Am I missing some type of communication? Or is the person that they're communicating with, I guess it would be God in this sense, right? Is God not communicating with me, but he's communicating with others, right? What is it about me that makes me kind of feel like the outsider? So he's really trying, right? And I think people that are experiencing spiritual crisis, I think we'd be kind of remiss to think that, just to be dismissive and just think, oh, they're just in a mood or something. I think we really need to understand what they're hearing, how they're perceiving the world, so that we can help them, right? He says, I'm like a gazer who should mark an inland company, standing and finger and hark the glorious distant scene. So he says, I would like to be that person out in the tower, looking off the sea and say, hey, there it is. He says, but all he sees, he says, and feel, alas, 'tis but yon dark and windswept pine to me. So he wants to be that person who looks out and sees the sea, but all he can see are trees. He says, yet I would bear my shortcomings with meet tranquility, but for the charge that blessed things I'd liefer or prefer not have be. Oh, doth a bird deprived of wings go earthbound willfully? I don't want to be in this state, but he is, right? So the question is, how do you overcome it? Enough as yet disquiet clings about us, rest shall we? And so in a similar way, we see ideas of Rodin's thinker, right? In the modern world, we're trying to understand, right? We're trying to reconnect. And it just seems that the exterior forces, right? The noises that surround us and the chaos of the modern busyness of the world, the urbanization, the industrialization, seems as though it's clouding out that spiritual connection, and people are starting to lose that. The convergence of twain is also another kind of quasi spiritual, looking for spirituality, looking for meaning, I suppose, in the modern world. The convergence of twain means the coming together of two, and this is written right after the Titanic. And so the convergence of two is about the Titanic, the sinking of the Titanic. And so in one, you're going to see the Titanic and a creation of humanity. And then you're going to see the creation of nature or the universe, or he's going to call it the immanent will. Is going to create an iceberg. And so these two elements are going to come together. He says, in the solitude of the sea, deep from human vanity, the pride of life that planned her, stilly crouches she. And so this is the Titanic going through the North Atlantic. Steel chambers late the pyres of her salamandrine fires, cold currents trid and turn to rhythmic tidal lyres. And so this is kind of the engine as it goes through. Over the mirrors meant to glass the opulent, the steel worm crawls, grotesque, climb, dumb, indifferent. So this is the creation of humanity, something that's dumb, something that thinks as though it's just filled with all of this vanity, the vanity of this modern world of materialism. Jewels and joy designed to ravish the sensuous mind lie lightless, and their sparkles bleared black and blind. Dim moon-eyed fish near gazed at the gilded gear and query, what does this vangloriousness down here? So the fish that are swimming by in the North Atlantic are like, I've never seen anything like this. What's going on here? But what we see is this kind of vanity of human beings, right? That we're creating something that they said at the time that God himself could not sink. And so this idea of, Nietzsche's idea that we're killing God, we're losing our spirituality, we're losing our connection, and that's a concern about where we're going. We see that here, similar ideas about the direction of humanity. Well, while fashioning this creature of cleaving wing, the immanent will, again, notice the capitalization, so this is an entity, that stirs and urges everything, prepared a sinister mate for her so gaily great, a shape of ice for time and far dissociate. And so this immanent will, I guess you can call it God. I hate to use that term in the sense of a Thomas Hardy poem, because I don't know, it doesn't necessarily seem to fit. He's really trying to struggle of what's controlling things, right? And so he just kind of gives it, he personifies what's controlling things, whether it's happenstance or some other will that's out there that's seeking our destruction. So I have a hard time with that connection. So I just kind of use Thomas Hardy's terms instead. But this idea is that this immanent will, this knower, knows what's going to happen in the future, and is now preparing this sinister mate. Prepared a sinister mate for her so gaily great, a shape of ice for the time far and dissociate. And as the smart ship grew in stature, grace, and hue, in the shadowy silent distance grew the iceberg too. Alien they seemed to be, no mortal eye could see the intimate welding of their later history, or sign that were bent by paths coincident on being anon twin halves of one august event. Till the spinner of years said now, and each one hears the consummation comes and jars two hemispheres, North Atlantic and Europe. And so he suggests that there is something out there controlling us, right? Trying to make sense of it. It seems as though if there's something controlling us, it might not necessarily be for our benefit. It might be leading to our destruction. At least that's the sense that he's making based on the modern world that he's living in. Taking a look at channel firing, we see again some inclinations of fear about the direction of where humanity is going. And we see that with channel firing. He wrote channel firing, I believe it was in 1912, right at the cusp, again, of World War I. And what we see here is that each nation, whether it was England or Austria, Germany, or France, or Russia, whoever the case may be, all of these nations were preparing for war, right? They were preparing to, and they did this all in the name of national defense. We're just building up our military in order to protect ourselves from invaders. But the problem is you can only march, your military in the streets and justify increased spending for so long until there's a war. And so there's this sense that war is on the horizon, and people are readily embracing it. People are kind of excitedly suggesting, when do we get to go kill the Germans, or when do we get to kill the French, or whatever the case may be, whatever side they were on. They were all excited, thinking that this is going to be a very short war. And Thomas Hardy captures that insanity of what the direction of humanity is going, what this is going to lead to. Trying to, again, hold up a mirror to society to say, hey, this is where this is going. Do you not see this? He says, That night your great guns, unawares, shook all our coffins as we lay and broke the chancel window squares. We thought it was Judgment Day. And so the person speaking here are the dead. Generally in Europe, they bury the dead. The cemeteries are generally really close to a cathedral or to a church. And so as a bullet kind of goes through the window of the cathedral, all of the dead say, "Hey, it must be Judgment Day." We sat upright while dreary summer rose, the howl of wakened hounds. The mouse let fall the altar crumb. The worms drew back into their mouths. And so this is something every time there's a gunshot, everyone stops and says, "Is now the time?" Right? Is now going to be the war? And what we have now are people that have all of this technology that they can use in order to kill people. And so there's the sense that this is going to be the war that ends all wars. This is going to be, Judgment Day. This is going to be the end of the world, this kind of apocalyptic event. The glebe cow drooled till God said, "No, it's gunnery practice out at sea, just as you were when you went below. The world is as it used to be." So no, it's not really World War I yet, right? All nations, and this is God continuing on, or Hardy's version of God continuing on, he says, "And all nations striving strong to make red war yet redder." And so each nation is trying to increase their weaponry in order to bleed the other side. "Mad as hatter, they do no more for Christ's sake than you who are helpless in such matters. That this is not the judgment hour, for some of them's a blessed thing, for if it were, they'd have to scour hell's floor for so much threatening. Ha ha, it'll be warmer when I blow the trumpet, if indeed I ever do, for you are men and rest eternal sorely need." And so again, it shifts back to now the dead. "So down we lay again. I wonder will the world ever saner be," said one, "than when he sent us under in our indifferent century." And many a skeleton shook his head. "Instead of preaching 40 year, my neighbor Parson Thirdly said, I wish I had stuck to pipes and beer." Again the guns disturb the hour, roaring their readiness to avenge, and as far inland as Towerton Tower, Camelot, and starlit Stonehenge. And so this idea of this madness of going to war, why are we so excitedly embracing the idea of killing other people, right? So, but when you think about life as a competition for resources, that I'm just going to go use their resources, take their land, they have something that belongs to me, is the mindset, or the idea that this is the struggle of the survival of the fittest. We're going to be fitter than our enemy, right? When you start to look at humanity differently as just animals or organisms, just biological tissue, right? You can start to justify a lot of violence against human beings. And so that's what we're going to see is going to be one of the major overshadowing features of the 20th century. And artists are seeing this, right? They're capturing these scents. And a lot of people aren't really aware, right? They're just kind of going along thinking, hey, let's go to war. But artists are seeing this and they're kind of reflecting. They're saying, do we really want to go this direction, right? They're kind of getting us to pause. And I just wanted to leave off with He Never Expected Much. This is a good bookend to Hap because it's kind of an answer in some ways to Hap and how to find happiness or how to find joy or how to find at least solace or comfort in a world that seems as though it's so destructive and so problematic and so chaotic. He says, "Well, world, you've kept your faith with me." And that's kind of a positive note for Hardy. We've kind of known him to be a little bit grumpy and sad. But, the kept faith, that's some positive way. "Kept faith with me. Upon the whole, you proved to be much as you said you were. Since as a child I used to lie upon the leaves and watch the sky. Never I own expected I that life would all be fair. 'Twas then you said, insensive said, time-sensitive said, in that mysterious voice you shed from clouds and hills around. Many have loved me desperately, many with smooth serenity, while some have shown contempt of me till they dropped underground." And so I want you to think about what is it that nature is teaching, right? We've seen that before, right? Nature teaches people in the Renaissance certain elements. They teach people in the Enlightenment certain elements. They teach people in Romanticism certain elements. What is the modern world teaching Thomas Hardy? He says, the very end, "I do not promise overmuch, child, overmuch. Just neutral tinted haps and such. You said to minds like mine, wise warning for your credit's sake, which I for one failed not to take, and hence could stem such strain and ache as each year might assign." And so what is nature promise? Nothing. What did he get from nature? Nothing. But there's a sense of happiness or at least contentment within that because he didn't expect more. So he's at least not disappointed. There's a sense of disappointment within Hap. Kind of that was one of his earlier works. This is written towards the end or the later part of Thomas Hardy's life. There's a sense of finding peace eventually within that. How do we find peace and strength within a world and kind of this fortitude in a world that seems to be crumbling and seems to be moving towards ashes. How do we do that, right? That's going to be some type of inner strength that we find within us.